Hi, everybody. Welcome. I think there's a bunch of people joining, but we're going to get started. To start with, please tell us where you're joining us from. If you care to in the chat, love to see who all is a part of this webinar. You can just, a couple other housekeeping things. You can ask questions using the chat feature for this webinar. Speakers are going to answer as many as they can. I think there'll be time kind of throughout this hour to answer, as well as some time at the end. Another thing to mention is that we're going to share an evaluation link at the end of this event. We really appreciate if you take a couple minutes to fill it out. It always helps us improve our events. And as it was also said on the previous screen, this webinar today is entitled Climate Change in Agriculture, Precipitation Dynamics. This event is being brought to you by PASA Sustainable Agriculture. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization that administers farmer training, research, policy, peer education, and local food programs. We're a network of tens of thousands of farmers, food system professionals, and change makers working together to advance regenerative and equitable agriculture at home and in our communities. You can learn more about our work at pasafarming.org. So our presenters today are Rachel Schattman from the University of Maine, Sara Kelemen from American Farmland Trust, and Mike Snow from the Connecticut River Watershed Farmers Alliance. We'll let them go ahead and take it away. Really excited to have them share with us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So we're really appreciative of you all joining us today. Welcome back for the folks who were here last week when we talked about temperature dynamics. Just a quick note of overview. We've got a lot of stuff to share with you today, but we're really excited to hear what you're thinking about and questions that you might have as we go along. So please feel free to use the chat liberally, and we will answer things as we go, as well as we have a few minutes at the end. So today's focus is very much going to be on water and water management. We have some discussion about planning at different timescales. We have some thoughts about on-farm water management. And I think between the three of us, we have a pretty well-rounded presentation for you here today. Next slide, please. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. Sarah is going to go over some precipitation data and trends just to get us all on the same page. Mike is going to give us a visual tour of what too much water on the landscape looks like, and then we're going to talk about what tools are out there for addressing this particular problem. And then we're going to transition to talking about what too little water on the farm looks like, again, through a photo safari, and then back for tools for addressing too little water. And then we'll cap it off with a discussion. All right, so at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah, and she is going to take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for spending some time with us this afternoon. So just to orient all of us to what we're talking about here, just want to run through some fundamentals real quick. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about the process by which greenhouse gases and other processes heat Earth's atmosphere, which in turn raises the average temperature of the Earth. So a warmer atmosphere can hold more water, 7% more for every 1 degree increase in temperature, to be precise, 1.8 degree increase Fahrenheit. So as we see temperature rise, we also see an intensification of the Earth's water cycle, which can cause uneven precipitation around the world, and maybe at times that we're not used to. So some places will be more affected by precipitation, other places will receive less. So these changes in temperature and precipitation are the kind of two fundamental primary outcomes of climate change. And then these impacts that I have listed here are what will affect our agricultural systems. So these include extreme weather events, changes in water availability, shifting pest and weed life cycles, wildfire, as I saw someone mention in the chat, and the list kind of goes on and on. So we're going to touch more on these impacts later, specifically as they relate to precipitation. But I hope that this summary kind of shows you how our changing climate is going to impact the agricultural system as we know it. So next slide, please. Okay, so then bringing it down to focus more on our region. When we think about what we're seeing, changes in the Northeast, regional effects are multifaceted. So the coast of our region is warming faster than inland. And because of changes in precipitation, we're seeing longer mud season, heavier snowfalls. So the snow is literally heavier because it's often warmer, more frequent big rains, more rains during olive seasons. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we're getting more precipitation, but drought intensity and duration is not decreasing as much as we would expect, given the fact that we're getting much more precipitation. Okay, as I mentioned, a warmer atmosphere holds more water. This is like one of the fundamental things that we're dealing with when we think about climate change. For every 1.8 degree increase Fahrenheit in temperature, or 1 degree increase in Celsius in temperature, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. So how does this impact us? Next slide, please. We get more precipitation in the Northeast. So, and in this figure on the right, you can see percent change in precipitation since 1901. So you can see that some parts of the country are getting a lot more precipitation, some parts are getting a lot less. And in the Northeast, we're generally seeing an increase in precipitation of between 10 and up to 30%. And you can see that this rise is more sharp, it's more steep since about 1960. That blue trend line, you can just watch as we get more and more summer precipitation in the Northeast. And when it rains, it pours, is something that we've been experiencing here. So we're getting more extreme precipitation, and more of our precipitation is falling in these really big events. So what this figure is showing is that since 1901, 38% more of our precipitation is falling during the heaviest 1% of events. And I'm probably not telling you anything that's feeling like brand new. You're farmers or you're working with farmers. This is something that probably feels kind of intuitive to you, but I just want to share this figure so that you know that what you're feeling is backed up by the data. Okay, I love this figure. So you can see both drought in the kind of warm colors and precipitation in the cool colors since 1895. And the reason why I want to show this is to say that even though we're seeing more precipitation, we're still getting droughts. So we're just getting the word that I used before, which I think is very appropriate, is intensification of the water cycle. So you can see we're kind of trending more towards wetter years, but we still do get drought conditions over time. Bringing it down even a little bit more, this is just kind of like a snapshot of a couple different years. So even though we're getting more precipitation, you can still see that in the Northeast, there's been extreme drought a couple times in this kind of 4-year time span. So when we're thinking about adapting to climate change, we need to be thinking about both managing for more water and less water. It's really hard, but that's why we're here to talk about it.
Okay, what does too much water look like? You've probably seen quite a bit this recently. This is a farm in Vermont, actually a few farms in Vermont. So sometimes we get flood, right? And that can lead to erosion. This is a 10-acre vegetable field. The whole thing was underwater. This is just as it's drying out. And you can see a whole strawberry crop is wiped out on the right. You can't see it, but that was there. It was a couple acres of strawberries. In this field, the only thing that really made it was the vegetables on the left. Everything else has since been tilled under. This farm up in northern Vermont, Richard has said that they're used to getting some silting along the river, usually in the spring, but now what they're seeing are these flood events and this is the second year in a row for his farm, intensive events that just scour fields away and take, trees. You can see a lot of debris, and that was all moved off the field previous to the picture. Same farm. This whole field was scoured clean, was bare soil after having a cover crop on it. again, the second year in a row, and the water actually came up to, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but sort of the top of the stairs, basically, on this barn. It's a lot of water, right? All sorts of damage. And then crop loss is one of the main things. Crop loss and great photo op with the senator. Animal, if you're not careful, you can lose animals, or at least cause them health problems if they have to stand in water for a while, if they don't have any place to go. And then feed and forage is also a problem. You end up having mycotoxin problems. You could have quality problems. So this person probably lost all of this, couldn't feed any of it out. This is a feed corn, silage corn. This was a sweet corn patch, and obviously there's probably not going to get much crop there. But I think it's not always a flood, right? Sometimes it's just heavy rain events. How do we deal with that? What does that look like? I'm not sure if any of you are CSA farmers, but usually we plan on, those 400 heads of cabbage every week, right? Well, even losing parts of your field can be a problem for some farms. We have to learn how to manage for that, right? Plant more, perhaps. Again, you're not really going to get much of a crop there. Even when you're anticipating a wetter spot, you can still have problems. This farm had grown garlic and onions on ridges in case, because they knew it was sort of a wetter field, and you end up with poor quality, something that won't store or that you can't even sell.
So I bet we're all feeling super upbeat right now. Let me transition us into the things that can help us deal with some of the wet pressures that we've been experiencing and facing, and are likely to experience more of in coming years. You can move ahead, Mike. Thank you. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is tools, informational tools to help with planning. And specifically some of the forecasts that the National Weather Service provides. And I imagine there are some of you who are saying, oh my God, are we really talking about weather forecasts here? I know how to listen to the weather. I know how to read a weather forecast. And I challenge you to explain it to your grandmother, because I think these are actually a little bit more complicated than they look at first. And to make really good, meaningful sense of them, you actually need to piece some different pieces of information together. So bear with me and open yourself up to perhaps learning something new about the National Weather Service. All right, so the National Weather Service provides a couple different types of outlooks. I'm sure we're all familiar with the 8 to 14 day outlooks. These tend to be fairly reliable. They've gotten a lot more reliable in the last few years, or last decade. They also provide 1 month outlooks, 3 month outlooks, and seasonal outlooks, which all have various degrees of reliability and various purposes. So this is, on this slide, you have kind of one of each of the medium to long-term outlooks, so 18 to 14, a monthly and a seasonal. What you will notice is that they are color-coded for what you can expect in terms of the chances that the conditions are going to be above, near normal, or below normal. The piece of information that you need in order to make reasonably good sense of this, however, is what normal is, which, I think maybe some people have a gut intuition, but it's always nice to actually look at the data. Next slide, please. There are a couple of different places you can go to get differently scaled information about what normal is. This is a tool called the Climate Reanalyzer, which is hosted out of the Maine Climate Office, but has information that's relevant for all over the continental US and many parts of the world. One of the things that they provide, and for those of you who were on the webinar last week, you'll remember Sean Burkle. He's the one who put this website together, and it has a lot of really interesting stuff. He has really interesting stuff to share there. One of the things that they provide is what's known as an anomaly chart. which is kind of like those maps that we just looked at, but it tells you over a long period of time what the chances are that conditions would be above or below normal, but it doesn't give you kind of the actual amount. So to go to the actual amount, I point people towards what's called the PRISM Climate Group, which I don't think is a place that folks often think to check when they're trying to make sense of a weather forecast, but it can be really, really valuable place. So the PRISM Climate Group is out of Oregon State University, and they provide both historical weather information down to the daily time scale, but also kind of annual and monthly, if that's what you like. They also provide forecasts using different climate models and climate ensembles, which is really, really helpful. But for the purpose of our discussion today, the thing I'm going to point out is that they provide these reports that say, for example, that the 30-year average rainfall for Pennsylvania on November 15th is between 0.08 and 0.15 inches of rain. So that's normal. You can then take that, go back to these maps and say, well, it's looking like in the next 14 days, it's an above, we have a chance of getting more than that typical amount. The National Weather Service also provides longer outlooks, kind of looking further ahead, kind of arranged in a very similar way, giving you information about whether or not the chances are that conditions will be above, below, or more closely aligned with normal. You can see the list of monthly outlooks that they provide on this 3-month outlook official forecast page. I know it looks like it was built in the 1990s, but it's really chock full of super useful information. The nice thing about this portal is that they provide their own assessment of what is or is not normal. You have to dig around a little bit to find it, but if you go to the next slide, they provide something that is somewhat akin to what I just showed you from the climate group. The difference is that the time scale that they're using here is aligned with their forecast. This can be the thing that's very tricky to parse out when you're trying to look further ahead than 12 days, is you have to be really sensitive to how far out you're looking, and also kind of what you're using as your reference point. And of course, there is the giant caveat that we have gotten much better at producing reliable forecasts for the near future. But the further out you go, the less reliable the forecast is. Sometimes thinking out a couple of months is really, really useful. And sometimes it can kind of give us a little bit of false hope or false understanding about what's going on. I like to think about it in terms of, is it an El Nino year or a La Nina year? What does that mean for our region? Are we thinking that it's going to be drier than normal or wetter than normal? And beyond that, it seems a little bit hard to make concrete plans. But if you are dealing with, let's say, multiple different land bases, maybe you have a wet area of your farm and a dry area of your farm, having a little bit of insight into what the season ahead might bring could be useful for some of that more long-range planning. All right, so I have 3 more slides in this section. I'm going to transition to thinking about really long-scale planning, as in, like, where are you going to put your barns or your buildings, or where are you going to develop new fields? Are you going to purchase new land? And put a plug out there for the very accessible information that FEMA has on their website, specifically their flood map. So they have very fine resolution maps that show wet areas, culverts, areas that have been flooded, and you know, some of the information may be a little bit dated, but I think it's still worth always, before you do any large land development project, checking out the FEMA website, and then also kind of considering it if you're thinking about revising anything about your production area. There is also, I think, more resources becoming available through different support groups, like Maine Farmland Trust, which is local here, but I think there are probably also, I know we have folks here from all over the country, really. So it's worth checking in with your local agencies or or ag advisors to see if anyone has this particular skill set. But folks who are able to look at your land and do a little bit more of a water focused assessment to understand what areas are higher risk, what areas are kind of intersected by water flow, and what areas need attention if you are going to be doing any improvement. And then I'll end my section by just saying the USGS is an incredible resource that I think we don't often tap into in the ag community, but I think if we are thinking about water management, we should get much more comfortable with it. This is an example of one of the tools that the New England Water Science Center has prepared, which takes a very fine-grained watershed level analysis, applies climate forecasts to it, and then makes estimations under different emission scenarios about what will happen to groundwater recharge, snowpack, stream flow, etc. Right now, this information is only available for New Hampshire, but we're just starting a project with USGS that will expand it to other states in the Northeast. And it's something that I'm really excited about. And I'm excited about kind of sharing it with people once we get a broader geographic region mapped out.
Okay, so what does that mean for us as growers? I kind of think of this in three pieces, at least when it comes to flood management or too much water. But you'll see that really we're talking about the same type of thing with not enough water usually. So risk management, we have some questions we need to ask ourselves. Soil and crop management, talk a little bit about that. And thinking uphill, explain that in a second. So the first thing that we might want to do is ask, should we farm here, right? A lot of our, at least in the Northeast in particular, but New England, a lot of our prime soils are our best farmland is former floodplain, right? The floodplain that was drained and became good cropland, annual crops, but really it wants to be wet, or at least it wants to, historically wanted to accept water for a while. So this farm is a dairy farm that's going out of business now. They're about to sell, and one question is, should it be developed? Should it be continued to be farmed, or should it actually be used to handle floodwater? Because so this part of the farm especially floods, and when it does, it actually saves the town of Wilmington by holding on to a lot of water before it gets to Wilmington, right? And then in the last 2 years, there have been major floods, and by the farm holding onto that water has actually kept the town from sort of being washed away. Previously, they had some levees and stuff so that the creek stayed in its banks and went much faster into town and wiped out a big portion of town. So that's one question. Should we be farming in certain places, right? Then for you as a farmer, that question may not be to give it up, right? So this is a vegetable field. It also has flooded twice in the last 2 years, actually 3 times in the last 2 years, I should say. But for a vegetable grower who sells direct, you know, even 7 out of 10 years of successful growing is enough to pay, you know, sort of covers the cost, right? Even if there were 3 years loss, and we're talking tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of loss, it's still sort of worth it in that sense. This farmer is going to think about whether he's going to risk it again next year. He doesn't know yet. But these are the kinds of thoughts that you might want to ask yourself. What's the risk and how do I manage it? And then another question is, do you head to higher ground, right? Do we get out of those floodplains, or at least particular fields that tend to flood? Do we let them go? Then we ask ourselves, well, what should we be growing in certain areas? If we tend to get too much water, if that's a normal thing, then does anybody know what this is? This crop? Correct, it's rice. So, you know, it might seem kind of like a niche crop in the Northeast. In New York State, they're actually looking at rice as a crop to grow in floodplains and in particularly wet areas, because it can handle excess water for a while and then come through the wet period. It also could be cleaning water, so there are certain benefits, but the main thing is, what do we want to be growing in a certain area? All right, the next piece that I think about as a grower is how we farm, right? So we know that if we need to deal with a lot of water or also not enough water, our practices make a difference, right? So we know that focusing on soil health, we can increase water holding capacity, we can increase the ability of our crops to survive excessive events. Compaction is one example, right? So in the study on the left, basically what we're looking at is a difference in compaction. And you have compacted soil, there's just not a lot of room for water to go. It tends to sit on top or run off. How do we deal with that? We look at a blank screen. So we might have good soil. This is okay, right? We see earthworms. It's a little chunky. That is compacted. Here's the soil that has is not looking too good, right? There's a lot of probably crusting on the surface there. How do we get that? Well, poorly timed tillage, excessive tillage, the wrong kind of tillage. Not to say that a rototiller is always bad, but it's not always good. I'll admit that sometimes I like a real clean field, and that's how we farm. That's often how we start, especially if you're organic. But there are drawbacks, and it often can cause compaction, even on a light soil. Other things, traffic, right? So this farm cutting silage corn, a lot of traffic all over the field. These are some of our best soils in Vermont, and they drive over it like this a couple times a year, and they wonder why maybe they don't get the best yields, or why this field in particular tends to be a little wet. So what things we can do: controlled traffic on a veggie farm that may be a little more intuitive. Sorry about the poor picture, but you can see that basically we're driving in the same place all the time, right? And you can do that on a big scale, and they do that now out in the Midwest and in the big the big growing regions. Controlled traffic farming, we can all do it. Then there's, how do you break up compaction? You can do it by hand, right? Double digging. You can use a big U-bar, a broad fork. Mechanically, we can do it with a ripper, and I'm showing a couple of different types here. There's a chisel plow on the upper right, not a ripper, right? This causes a lot of vertical tillage. A nice ripper like this Yeoman's type plow, or J.M. Shirk in Pennsylvania, they sell sort of an American version now. You can see it's like an incision, right? This is one way to relieve compaction. And there is a method to that madness, and we can talk about that if you have questions. Basically, you don't want to go too deep. You want to look for your soil compaction layer, go just an inch or two under it, break it up, and then do that several times over the next couple of years to try to relieve compacted areas. And we'll talk more about this in a second. Biologically, we can do this with cover crops. So this is one example. Tillage radish, it's a great cover crop. It also gives you the benefit of tilling less, right? So you grow it in the fall, you plant it in late summer, grows all fall. And this is on the right what you end up with in the next spring: a bare soil with weed control for several weeks in the early spring. And then you can seed without tilling, and then you end up with a nice crop that doesn't need tillage for cultivation for a while. Then there's also summertime cover crops, or diverse cover crops. So the C4 grasses can, their roots go down pretty deep. It's something like sorghum, Sudan grass, pearl millet. You grow it up tall, mow it, grow it up again, mow it. You could do this several times over the course of a summer if you can fallow a piece of land and break up the compaction that way. Just want to mention, though, that actually combining these things together, so the mechanical and the biological, is probably an even better way for us to do this. So if you can seed at the same time, then plant roots will go into the rip, and they'll hopefully keep the fractured plow pan from sort of sealing back up, which sometimes happens. An example of this is the Vermont rip sower, which includes a tank for putting in some sort of biological amendment, right? Because it's really the microbes that are going to break up compaction or help improve the soil. Then seed box and the ripper, another example of it and what it can look like in a pasture. Then obviously adding organic matter however we can, really important, makes a big difference. And then finally, we can get up out of the mud by growing on ridges, ridge till, raised beds. So I used to make ridges with this potato hiller. You could use any kind of discs. Raised beds with plastic. Mulch, really important, right? Slows down water when it lands. It doesn't compact the surface as much because the pressure, the weight of the raindrop, right, causes a lot of surface compaction. And then also it keeps disease from splashing from the ground back up onto your crop. And then we can also talk about growing mulch in place, which I think we'll talk about again later. So sort of a no-till or a reduced till can also really keep your plants clean. And that's probably one of the best benefits, as well as dealing with excess moisture. I'm sorry, soil compaction from rain. All right, and then we can also do something similar if we use living mulches in between crops, seed them under crops. So you might start with something clean, cultivate. Your last time cultivating, you seed, and then you get a cover crop or a relay crop that grows underneath it. And then in the spring, if that's a fall broccoli crop, you might end up with something like this. And then finally, we want to talk about what's uphill. So, right, our farms don't exist in a vacuum. And when we get a lot of precipitation, what's going on upstream or uphill is going to affect our fields down below, right? So one thing we can do is we can stop water, we can slow water, or we can spread it out, or do all of these things. Historically, people have been using check dams for centuries. The Romans dealt with the same problems that we're dealing with now. So creating swales allows us to hold water. I'll show another picture in a second, but I just want to point out that the water sort of sets in the swale, which is on contour or just barely off, and water eventually matriculates downhill, which would be important in dry years. This is what it can look like. It can look like a lot of things, right? This can work on any scale. It can be hand dug. It can be pitched so that the swale is actually at a 1% grade, and then the water will slowly move into a pond. Again, you can have a series of ponds. So here's a swale, that's the in, and then the overflow takes it back out to another part of the field or to another pond. And then you can do this with whole landscapes. And it's sort of time that we need to be talking about this, because this kind of landscape can, one, help manage for heavy rainfall events, flood control, but it also helps us deal with drought conditions. Hopefully you're okay listening to my voice. So what does not enough water look like? This is actually a stock photo, right? This is what we think of when we think of drought. But up in the North Country, at least for us, it might look like something like this. Not Dave, but a small ear of corn, right? It might look like a lot of irrigating, which might look like low ponds. If you're a livestock producer, you might be looking at not enough forage, right? Grass isn't going to grow back as well. The forage that we cut, our hay, might be really light too. So we end up without feed in our barn for the winter, which means that we're shipping a lot of feed in. And in years where there's too much rain, like last year, we had folks who might normally have cut say 2,000 bales and they cut 200 last year, right? Which means that they're either selling animals, or you're either selling animals, or you're buying feed in, sometimes from the Midwest or even the West. All right, we're just gonna again sort of talk as a grower, how do we think about this, and come back to this landscape idea and how this can help us with dry times. So originally, this sort of series of ponds, while it wasn't invented by the Australians, it was sort of reconceptualized there. And by holding on to water when it does come, and then having a series of these contoured swales, they can manage it in the dry time. And they would just do this sheet irrigating. Kind of interesting way to get through a dry spell. And you can see that this isn't a particularly steep slope, so it works even in the flatter grounds. Here's another example. So on the left here, you have this farm lane, and we're heading downhill. And they're actually taking water off the farm, right? Because we see a lot of water that in roads or in ditches, ditches are sort of replumbing our watershed. So this farm is actually taking water from the road that would be otherwise just going downhill on the road, and taking that out onto his field. And you can actually see this is a ridge, and it's dry, which is normal, but he's actually taking water and he's going to rehydrate the ridge, which is sort of an exceptional concept. And then some farming practices before I hand off to Sara. Dry farming, how do we do that? What does that mean? Well, sometimes that is variety selection. Drought hardy or drought tolerant varieties might have smaller leaves and might be thriftier and have deeper, stronger root systems. We might be planting farther apart, a lower population. Tomatoes are a nice example of dry farming. People plant them really deep. They might get watered early on and then they're left. So the yield might go down, but the quality goes up quite a bit, actually. A dust mulch is another technique that some farms use out west historically. There's some debate over whether it works. It does seem to work. So you can kind of see, if you look in the picture here, where the bed hasn't been cultivated, right, or the wheel tracks, you can see the moisture right up to the surface. And so there's sort of this capillary action of water being drawn from the soil up out of the soil to be transpired into the atmosphere, or to be evaporated into the atmosphere. Well, if you can break up the top inch or two of the soil, then you break that capillary action. So it might look something like this on the right. This was a bed that was used a basket weeder on it, and that sort of broke up just the surface. And so we see when it gets dry that if you stick your finger under that first inch or two, it's actually moist, but the top inch or two is dry. You could do that with tine weeders. You could do that with something like a Lilliston. Do that with something like a basket weeder. Whatever you got, whatever you like.
I'm just gonna take us home here real quick, talk about a couple more tools you can use for managing too little water. And clearly we're all excited about mulch here today. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about mulch. First, I'm gonna talk about grown in place mulch. So basically what this picture on the left is the stand of ryegrass. And the first step is you grow it. The second step is you somehow want to make it flat and make it actually dead. Often when you flatten a mulch that you've grown in place, you're not actually terminating it when you flatten it. I mean, some people have a roller crimper. Sometimes that works really well. Sometimes it doesn't. So if it's available to you at your scale, tarping can be a really effective way to make sure that grown in place mulch is actually terminated. And then, you kind of let it solarize for a little while, make sure it's actually good and dead. And then you can plant right into it. And that mulch will keep the moisture in the soil layer. This picture on the right is from a farmer friend in California who farms in the Sacramento Valley. So it's hot. This picture was taken when it was in the 90s in July. And he said that when he reached his hand down in there to transplant the squash in, obviously this is taken after the squash was transplanted, but he reached his hand down into the soil and it was cool and wet down under that grown in place mulch. So that's one thing that you can do to make sure that you're retaining the moisture that's already in the soil instead of letting that soil layer get hot, and therefore more water will evaporate from it. You can also do cut and carry mulch. So this is a picture from a farm in Minnesota. They kind of do their cut and carry mulch a couple of ways. So they grow wheat, vetch, and rye all in combination. And then they chop it with a old dairy forage chopper and blow it into this little wagon that they have constructed that you can see here. And then they either unload it from the side into their high tunnels where they kind of scoop it and use it to mulch their tomato plants, or they also unload it from the side of the wagon into their tomato field rows. So it's kind of unloaded at the top of the row. And then these previously seeded rye and clover cover crops keep the paths nice. And then they kind of unload that green chop, the chopped mulch, and put it top dress those tomatoes to keep moisture in and to keep weeds down. So win-win. Moving to kind of the more like, those are the tools that you can get out there and you can do it. These are the more like thinky, planny type tools that I'm going to go over here real quick. So making a water management plan is a really good way to make sure that you actually have enough water when you need it for what you need it for. So you need to be thinking about your needs. What are your crop needs? What are your animal needs? And this is based on there are several sources that you can go to that'll show you, people are very familiar with doing this for livestock generally, but often vegetable producers don't really have a specific sense of how much water any given crop might need. Usually it's more of a general sense, so you can do these calculations specifically and get that number for what your crop will need. And then you ask yourself, what do I have and how much capacity do I have? How much can I deliver at a given time? And am I taking what I'm allowed to take? And once you have a plan and you have a sense of how much water you need versus how much water you have and can deploy on your farm when you need it, you'll have a sense of whether or not you need to develop new water sources. So we'll step through this a little bit. Okay, so the first thing is you need to calculate your need across the season. So generally, at least an inch of water per week. However, many crops are sensitive to drought about 2 to 3 weeks before harvest and harvest time. So there are some really nice figures, and maybe I can find them later and put them in the chat, or we can send them out with the slides, where you can see when different crops have their peak water needs. So you can make sure if you're experiencing a water shortage, you're at least able to supply water to the crops when they're at their peak water need. Okay, now thinking about water sources. Do you have a pond? Do you have a dug well? Do you have a deep well? Do you have an irrigation pond that you have built? And how much water do you actually have available in any of those sources at any given time? So really keeping track of the kind of, like testing your well, seeing how much water you actually have in your irrigation pond, so that when you're experiencing drought, it can feel like ignorance is bliss. Maybe I don't actually want to go and like stare into my irrigation pond to see how much is really in there, but really having a good sense of how much water you actually have on hand so that you can make those kind of triage decisions if you have to. And also asking, can I develop new water sources? What kind of funding pools are available that might help me with this pretty costly expense? And if you look around, you can usually find some. I've talked about this a little bit, but matching your water needs with available water. So this is a resource from the Maine Department of Agriculture. And basically it is a water needs calculator. So it takes what we know about how much water a crop needs and kind of helps you to understand how much water you're going to put on it given your source and your method of deploying that water, so that you have a sense of how much water you need and how much you're going to use. Okay, so that's your water management plan. And then there's the kind of emergency plan. So thinking about crop insurance and forage insurance. There's a couple of different programs that, there's standard crop insurance. There's also these more specific programs. So there's the pasture, rangeland, and forest program, which basically compares low precipitation to a historic average and will cover your yield loss if there's low precipitation. This is using kind of NOAA gridded data. So it's not specific to the precipitation on your farm, which can either help or hurt you if you get like a little bit more or a little bit less than what's average on your specific farm. Because as we know, microclimates are real and you can get a lot more precipitation or a lot less precipitation than your neighbor on your farm. So that's something to be aware of when you're thinking about this type of insurance. There's also the whole farm revenue protection program and micro farm, which is like a mini version of the whole farm revenue protection program. So the whole farm revenue protection program provides coverage for every crop on your farm under one insurance policy. And it's really meant for more specialty crop growers. And if you have this type of insurance, you can still insure individual crops. Microfarm is just basically a smaller version of that program for revenue up to $350,000. And you can't have any additional individual policies. And I've linked a couple of great webinars that will talk you through these programs in a little bit more detail because it could be a whole webinar itself. And finally, if you are experiencing drought, making sure that you're keeping good records. Oh, what happened? Keep good records.
I don't know. Sorry about that.
If there is some sort of disaster declaration, you want to make sure that you are eligible to participate in any sort of program that might help you recoup your losses. So the FSA puts out this disaster declaration table, and I just took a little screenshot here of some in Pennsylvania. This is for this year. It looks like there's a frost freeze disaster declaration. It was declared on June 12th. That's something that you need to make sure that you are keeping really good track of your records. Even just taking pictures, like if you experience a drought, take a lot of pictures, make sure you have timestamps. Keeping track of your yield will help you in the event that there is some sort of disaster declaration. And with that, we have reached the end of our presentation. So I will invite any questions that you have. You're welcome to, yes, good point. Rachel's saying that that calculator also works outside of Maine. There's nothing Maine specific about what's in the calculator. It was just developed by people in Maine. It uses, data for crop needs and the amount of water that different types of irrigation uses, same as anywhere else. So we invite questions. You can, I think the folks at PASA are going to allow you to unmute yourself if you want to ask it live, or you can type it into the chat and we will answer there.
I guess, please feel free to interrupt the conversation with a specific question. By all means, we also have a question for you to kick off a conversation just in the last 6 minutes of the hour. And we wanted to know just a little bit more about the tools that you find useful, because obviously these are things that we're all dealing with at the same time. And I'm sure there's stuff that you have come to rely on that we were not either able to pack in or we don't know about. So we're curious to hear from you all about what's been helpful, useful, etc. How unusual is the current lack of rain in Pennsylvania? That is a great question. I would say that one of the defining features of drought in the Northeast is that it is regionally discrete, and kind of like that slide that Sara showed at the very, very top of the presentation. You can have parts of the state or parts of the region that are in drought and other parts that have a surplus of water in the same time period. I do know that what you all are experiencing in Pennsylvania is similar to what's been going on in Ohio this year. Wisconsin comes to mind with what's been, they had like an incredibly wet spring, and then just a long period of dry weather and drought following it. And the big takeaway is that it's an intensification of maybe what we would have expected over the course of the past century or so, that what we're seeing is just an amplification. And that is primarily related to climate change. And we can expect that to become more extreme in the future.
I would just add that, drought it's not unusual to have a month or two of drier time in a given season, even and then maybe you have intense rain events. I mean, I almost feel like the biggest change that I've seen is really that when we do get rain, it tends to be a lot more, right? We'll get like 2 to 4 inches of rain, or in some cases these disastrous like 8 to 12 inches of rain. That's pretty crazy. But even 2 to 4 inches of rain can be a lot depending on our soils and our site, right? But in terms of the dry stuff, a lot of old timers will say, well, there's often a summer slump, and there or whatever, and August tends to be dry here. So that might be a little less unusual, but definitely the precipitation is, and there's no normal anymore, is really, that's the main thing, is that there's no normal. And as a vegetable grower, I mean, gosh, I don't think any of us should ever grow vegetables if we don't have water ready, right? Like it's like I used to farm in Southern Maryland, and it's like there are two things you could never do without. Like, you should not be planting anything if you don't have water and you don't have deer fence, right? And those are expensive infrastructures.
All right, we've got a message in the chat. Soil conservation, low-till practices have been immensely helpful for us to conserve moisture and also buffer against extreme rain events. I think we have had a lot more crop loss late this summer and fall if we had been cultivating and tilling more frequently. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we hand it back to Sara Bay to close us out? All right, well, I will just close by saying thank you first to Sara and Mike for co-presenting. Thank you for all of you for coming and sharing an hour with us. I hope you take something away from this talk that is useful to you. And thank you to PASA for hosting us for these last 2 webinars. Sara Bay, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just a thank you to you, Rachel, Sara, and Mike. I can't wait to dive into some of these tools and other info you provided. Thanks a lot for sharing all your expertise. We have the survey link right now in the chat for folks to grab. Really, again, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And also, please grab any of those other links that were getting put in by our presenters. We'll be sending a follow-up email for this webinar and the one last Friday with slides and all the links that were shared. So thanks so much, everybody. Take care.